April 2022, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan was removed in a no-confidence vote that was widely understood to have been organized by the country's military. At the time, Khan accused the United States of pushing for his removal, saying that a secret government cable revealed details about a meeting held in early March 2022 between State Department official Donald Lu and the Pakistani ambassador to the United States. The State Department at the time denied that claim and has been asked about it repeatedly since. Khan and his supporters have insisted it's true, and the U.S. government's denials have only gotten more aggressive since. In July, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Elizabeth Horst, who handles Pakistan, used the opportunity of a speech in Houston, which has a heavy Pakistani-American population, to address the charge, calling it, quote, propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation, unquote. The State Department has since simply mocked the allegation.
I know we both are sick of the same thing, but it's just both of our job is such that, So today the former foreign minister of Pakistan, while speaking to media after a month of detention and back and forth, he also came out and he said the cipher was reality. The U.S. officials was giving a démarche. So now you have a former prime minister, the military chiefs were sitting. So is the responsibility going on President Biden wanting to change the regime in Pakistan? Or the secretary? I mean, somebody has to take at least.
I feel like I need to bring just a sign that I can hold up in response to this question to say that allegation is not true. I don't know how many times I can say it. I will say, as I've said before, that the United States does not have a position on one political candidate or party versus another in Pakistan or in any other country.
After Imran Khan appeared on Counterpoints in early June, an interview that also ran on the Intercept podcast Deconstructed, which I host, a source from the Pakistani military reached out and ultimately provided us with a copy of the document, which, along with my colleague Murtaza Hussain, we have verified as authentic. The full text is published at The Intercept, but because Pakistan is under an extreme amount of censorship under the current regime, and The Intercept may be blocked there by the time you watch this, I want to read it here in full. The document was prepared by Pakistan Ambassador Asad Majid Khan. It reads, I had a luncheon meeting today with Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, Donald Lu. He was accompanied by Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Les Vigoury. DCM, DA, and Councillor Qasim joined me. At the outset, Don referred to Pakistan's position on the Ukraine crisis and said that, quote, people here and in Europe are quite concerned about why Pakistan is taking such an aggressively neutral position on Ukraine. If such a position is even possible, it does not seem such a neutral stand to us, unquote. He shared that in his discussions with the NSC, quote, it seems quite clear that this is the prime minister's policy, unquote. He continued that he was of the view that this was, quote, tied to the current political dramas in Islamabad that he, the prime minister, needs and is trying to show a public face, unquote. I replied that this was not a correct reading of the situation, as Pakistan's position on Ukraine was a result of intense interagency consultations. Pakistan had never resorted to conducting diplomacy in the public sphere. The prime minister's remarks during a political rally were in reaction to the public letter by European ambassadors in Islamabad, which was against diplomatic etiquette and protocol. Any political leader, whether in Pakistan or the US, would be constrained to give a public reply in such a situation. I asked Don if the reason for a strong US reaction was Pakistan's abstention in the voting in the UN General Assembly. He categorically replied in the negative and said that it was due to the prime minister's visit to Moscow. I think if the no confidence vote against the prime minister succeeds, all will be forgiven in Washington because the Russia visit is being looked at as a decision by the prime minister. Otherwise, I think it will be tough going ahead, unquote. He paused and then said, quote, I cannot tell how this will be seen by Europe, but I suspect their reaction will be similar, unquote. He then said that, quote, honestly, I think isolation of the prime minister will become very strong from Europe and the United States, unquote. Don further commented that it seemed that the prime minister's visit to Moscow was planned during the Beijing Olympics, and there was an attempt by the prime minister to meet Putin, which was not successful, and then this idea was hatched that he would go to Moscow. I told Don that this was a completely misinformed and wrong perception. The visit to Moscow had been in the works for at least a few years and was the result of a deliberative institutional process. I stressed that when the prime minister was flying to Moscow, Russian invasion of Ukraine had not started, and there was still hope for a peaceful resolution. I also point out that leaders of European countries were also traveling to Moscow around the same time. Don interjected that, quote, those visits were specifically for seeking resolution of the Ukraine standoff, while the prime minister's visit was for bilateral economic reasons. I drew his attention to the fact that the prime minister clearly regretted the situation while being in Moscow and had hoped for diplomacy to work. The prime minister's visit, I stressed, was purely in the bilateral context and should not be seen either as a condemnation or endorsement of Russia's action against Ukraine. I said that our position is dictated by our desire to keep the channels of communication with all sides open. Our subsequent statements at the UN and by our spokesperson spelled that out completely, while reaffirming our commitment to the principle of the UN Charter, non-use of or threat of use of force, sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, and pacific settlement of disputes. I also told Don that Pakistan was worried of how the Ukraine crisis would play out in the context of Afghanistan. We had paid a very high price due to the long-term impact of this conflict. Our priority was to have peace and stability in Afghanistan, for which it was imperative to have cooperation and coordination with all major powers, including Russia. From this perspective as well, keeping the channels of communication open was essential. This factor was also dictating our position on the Ukraine crisis. On my reference to the upcoming extended Troika meeting in Beijing, Don replied that there were still ongoing discussions in Washington on whether the U.S. should attend the extended Troika meeting or the upcoming Antalya meeting on Afghanistan with Russian representatives in attendance, as the U.S. focus right now was to discuss only Ukraine with Russia. I replied that this was exactly what we were afraid of. We did not want the Ukraine crisis to divert focus away from Afghanistan. Don did not comment. I told Don that just like him, I would also convey our perspective in a forthright manner. I said that over the past 1 year, we had been consistently sensing reluctance on the part of U.S. leadership to engage with our leadership. This reluctance had created a perception in Pakistan that we were being ignored and even taken for granted. There was also a feeling that while the U.S. expected Pakistan's support on all issues that were important to the U.S., it did not reciprocate, and we did not see much U.S. support on issues of concern for Pakistan, particularly on Kashmir. I said that it was extremely important to have functioning channels of communication at the highest level to remove such perception. I also said that we were surprised that if our position on the Ukraine crisis was so important for the U.S., why the U.S. had not engaged with us at the top leadership level prior to the Moscow visit, and even when the UN was scheduled to vote. The State Department had raised it at the DCM level. Pakistan valued continued high-level engagement, and for this reason, the foreign minister sought to speak with Secretary Blinken to personally explain Pakistan's position and perspective on the Ukraine crisis. The call has not materialized yet. Don replied that the thinking in Washington was that given the current political turmoil in Pakistan, this was not the right time for such engagement, and it could wait till the political situation in Pakistan settled down. I reiterated our position that countries should not be made to choose sides in a complex situation like the Ukraine crisis, and stressed the need for having active bilateral communications at the political leadership level. Don replied that, quote, you have conveyed your position clearly, and I will take it back to my leadership, unquote. I also told Don that we had seen his defense of the Indian position on the Ukraine crisis during the recently held Senate subcommittee hearing on U.S.-India relations. It seems that the U.S. was applying different criteria for India and Pakistan. Don responded that the U.S. lawmakers' strong feelings about India's abstentions in the UNSC and UNGA came out clearly during the hearing. I said that from the hearing, it appeared that the U.S. expected more from India than Pakistan, yet it appeared to be more concerned about Pakistan's position. Don was evasive and responded that Washington looked at the U.S.-India relationship very much through the lens of what was happening in China. He added that while India had a close relationship with Moscow, quote, I think we will actually see a change in India's policy once all Indian students are out of Ukraine, unquote. I expressed the hope that the issue of the prime minister's visit to Russia will not impact our bilateral ties. Don replied, I would argue that it has already created a dent in the relationship from our perspective. Let us wait for a few days to see whether the political situation changes, which would mean that we would not have a big disagreement about this issue and the dent would go away very quickly. Otherwise, we will have to confront this issue head on and decide how to manage it, unquote. We also discussed Afghanistan and other issues pertaining to bilateral ties. A separate communication follows on that part of our conversation. The document then reads assessment, and this is the ambassador's assessment. He writes, quote, Don could not have conveyed such a strong démarche without the express approval of the White House. to which he referred repeatedly. Clearly, Don spoke out of turn on Pakistan's internal political process. We need to seriously reflect on this and consider making an appropriate démarche to the U.S. All right, so that is the secret cable. People can now judge for themselves whether Khan's description was accurate. As for Khan, he was taken into custody this week and sentenced to 3 years in prison, a sentence that also bars him from running for office again. He is by far the most popular politician in Pakistan today. Khan, a famous cricketer, is a very rich man and spent the latter half of his life as a philanthropist. He's now convicted of selling gifts he was given while prime minister worth roughly $500,000, a charge his defenders point out is totally absurd given that he filed all the required paperwork and doesn't remotely need the money. And unlike in cases where the State Department has stood up against the jailing of political opponents on trumped-up charges, note the reference to Russia's Alexei Navalny at the very end here.
Do you guys have a reaction to the arrest of former Pakistan Prime Minister Khan, and do you think he got a fair trial?
We believe that is an internal matter for Pakistan, and we continue to call for the respect of democratic principles, human rights, and rule of law in Pakistan, as we do around the world.
The final one. Some people described that response pretty subdued and muted. Would you agree with that? And does that have anything to do with Khan's previous criticism of the United States when he was the Prime Minister?
So I thought I understood the first part of the question. Now I'm not sure I do. Would you? Oh, that's funny. Do you mean that our response was muted, or the response to his arrest? I first thought you were saying our response was muted.
The State Department's response to his arrest. Yeah.
I think first of all, I'll let people characterize our responses in all kinds of different ways. I think our response to this arrest and his previous arrests have been consistent at all times in declaring it an internal matter for Pakistan.
And nothing to do with his past criticism of the U.S.
So that's why you got the laugh from the back of the room while you were on vacation. I got this question a number of times. We do not believe it's related. No.
Can I just ask if it's related to this? Can I just
yeah.
So if Imran Khan's arrest and prosecution is an internal matter for Pakistan that you won't comment on, how is that different than the Navalny case?
There are times when we believe that prosecutions are completely unfounded.
So you think that there's some foundation to Imran Khan's arrest?
I would say there are times that we.
Let me just ask you a straightforward question.
I know, and I'm going to give you a straight's answer, but it's going to take me a minute.
Right. Okay.
So we believe that at times there are cases that are so obviously unfounded that the United States believes it should say something about the matter. We have not made that determination here.
With Imran Khan.
We believe it is an internal matter.
All right, so Emily, that is the cable that documents the meeting from March 7th, 2022, in which the State Department, pretty clearly told the Pakistan ambassador that if the Prime Minister Imran Khan was not removed, the country would be isolated, and if he was, then things would go back to normal. Can you see any wiggle room between the denials that the State Department has repeatedly offered, calling this disinformation, misinformation, propaganda, laughing it off, and what the document indicates actually happened?
I'm actually surprised, and my capacity to be surprised by the audacity of the sort of State Department in general, let alone this particular State Department. I'm actually surprised that I'm surprised, but that clip was so smug, and I think even the sort of calculated political strategy from a cynical perspective, it looks astoundingly dumb to be talking like that when you have the existence of pretty clear evidence as you're reporting here, refuting it, and it seems incredibly difficult for me to believe that Ned Price isn't aware of it, or that the State Department isn't aware of it, and their spokespeople aren't aware of it, that they have no idea this is just in the background, unless it was sort of like what they always show on Veep, and is a very real thing that happens in Washington, D.C. They keep the spokesperson out of the loop, so they have plausible deniability, and they can say, listen, maybe someone at the State Department knew about it, but I sure didn't, and I was told the opposite. I just can't believe that that video is going to come back to haunt them. It looks really bad, but maybe, Ryan, they simply don't care. In the same way, they simply don't care that this cable exists. They simply, maybe they preferred that it not get out, but now that it's out, it doesn't bother them all that much that A, they did it, and B, they seem to have lied about it. maybe not, because American foreign policy has operated this way without repercussions for a very long time.
It will be interesting to see how much of a kind of post-truth environment we're in now that the document is out, now that it's confirmed that this happened, whether the U.S. government, Biden administration, just continues to plow forward and say, nope, that didn't happen. Nope, we didn't do that, even in the face of it very clearly happening. The consequences for the Pakistani people are profound. We are very close to a place where it's hard to see a way out of a military dictatorship at any time in the near or even medium term future. We reported earlier that the news organizations in Pakistan have been ordered not to mention Imran Khan's name, which is, he's like a Trump-like figure in the country in the sense that every news organization wants to write articles about him and wants to talk about him on television because he drives ratings, he drives clicks. On digital media, there's some allowance given, but on broadcast media, they're pretty much barred from mentioning Imran Khan. When he was arrested and jailed and sentenced, they often referred to him as the chairman of PTI, the party. Like didn't even want to use his name. That's how dystopian the censorship regime and the authoritarian regime under the military and its allies that are running the country has gotten. And that is a product of what is effectively a coup that the U.S. sparked, that we sparked back in March of 2022. It worked in the sense that Pakistan is now sending ammunition to Ukraine, is an ally of the U.S. in its war in Ukraine, but at the cost of sending a country of 230 million people into an authoritarian tailspin, producing endless amounts of capital flight out of the country. Anybody with the means to do so is making preparations to leave the country, and thousands of supporters of Imran Khan have been detained. Many of them with credible reports of torture on just completely trumped up charges in a crisis that continues to spiral.
Well, and again, this is an issue. I'm looking at the Washington Post here, and obviously they note that Khan, as you note, denies the charges against him, but it's charges of concealing assets from the sale of state gifts during his time in office. And, it's going to look particularly bad, I think, for the Biden administration going forward as Hunter Biden is more and more in the news on this question, that the audacity of the United States, again, there's historical precedent for this going back decades, the audacity of the United States to meddle in other countries' affairs and to have this sort of smug posture towards these thinly veiled charges of corruption that are clearly partisan when you have some of this happening in your own backyard. I think that's a big problem for the Biden administration too. Not that it hasn't been a problem for the United States before, and one that we've just sort of blown past, but I think that plays into this context as well.
I think you're right too. Well, thanks everybody for joining us again. If you're watching this in Pakistan, feel free to clip as much of that document. Feel free to retype it. It's going to be difficult to, keep it, get it around the censorship regime. But I think if enough people are sharing it, clipping it, sending it around WhatsApp, it should be able to get out there. And hopefully this YouTube clip will stay up at least for a couple of days in Pakistan. We'll see.
And I'll just say on behalf of the Breaking Points team, how honored we are to have a reporter of Ryan's chops in our presence, especially here on Counterpoints. This is a really big story, and it's just been excellent to see this reporting up close, Ryan. Fantastic work on this one.
Well, thanks. Really appreciate it. Credit to the editors over at The Intercept and also my colleague Murtaza Hussain at The Intercept and all the producers here too. Really appreciate the legwork on it.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.